Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch, the show that brings you in-depth, expert analysis of all the major happenings on the international front. I am your host, Vikas Swarup. Our focus this week will be the conflict in Sudan, where the armed forces are battling a paramilitary group for control of the country and its capital, and where the unrest could have devastating consequences for the broader Horn of Africa region. Sudan is the third largest country in Africa by size and occupies a strategically sensitive area of the African continent, as well as a major part of the River Nile basin. Clashes erupted on April 15 following weeks of heightened tensions between the Sudanese army, led by the country's de facto head of state, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary group led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemedti. The two generals disagree over the proposed transition to civilian rule in Sudan. The fighting has killed at least 185 people and wounded more than 1,800, leaving critical infrastructure from Khartoum's airport to hospitals to water supplies for residents damaged. Among those killed is an Indian national identified as Albert Augustine, who was hit by a stray bullet. The European Union ambassador to Sudan has been assaulted in his own residency. The roots of the ongoing conflict go back to April 2019, when Sudan's long-serving authoritarian president Omar al-Bashir was overthrown by military generals following a countrywide uprising against him. Despite Bashir's ouster, civilians continued their demonstrations seeking democratic elections and the establishment of a civilian government. This led to an agreement between the military and the protesters 4 months later, under which it was decided to constitute the Sovereignty Council, a power-sharing body of military officers and civilians which would lead Sudan to elections at the end of 2023. Abdullah Hamdok was appointed Prime Minister for the transitional period, and he took office in August that year. But the new arrangement was short-lived as the military overthrew Hamdok's government in October 2021, and Burhan became de facto leader of the country. Dagalo, Vice President of the ruling council, and Burhan's partner in the military seizure of power, became the second in command. Burhan announced that the military would hold power until elections are held in July 2023. Soon after the 2021 coup, relations between the military and the RSF, which was formed in 2013, soured. Burhan and Dagalo disagree over how the 10,000-strong RSF should be integrated into the army and which authority should oversee that process. Dagalo also wanted to delay the integration for 10 years, but the army wanted it to happen in the next 2 years. Over the past few weeks, the RSF was redeployed around the country, which the army saw as a provocation and threat. With both sides on edge, a ferocious battle broke out last Saturday. Experts believe a full-blown civil war in Sudan could make things worse, from a new refugee crisis to water woes to meddlings by powers from outside the region. Heads of state from the regional bloc Intergovernmental Authority on Development have called for the immediate cessation of hostilities. A similar call has been made by the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has spoken to both the generals, asking them to end the violence. Our own Ministry of External Affairs has set up a dedicated control room for the nearly 1,500 Indian nationals who are based in multiple locations across Sudan. So what does this conflict mean for Sudan, and what is at stake for the region and for Africa? To discuss these issues, I have with me two outstanding experts. Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia is Distinguished Fellow Gateway House, former Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs, and former ambassador to Myanmar, Mexico, South Africa, and Kenya. A prolific columnist, he is also the author of 3 books on India's contemporary foreign policy, Myanmar, and Africa. Ms. Ruchita Beri has just superannuated from the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, where she was a senior research associate. Her research areas include political and security issues in sub-Saharan Africa, India-Africa relations, and emerging powers in Africa. A very warm welcome to both of you. Let me begin with you, Ambassador Bhatia. Now, Africa is known as the continent of promise. but it is also racked by conflict, with more than 35 non-international armed conflicts taking place there. What is the reason for so many conflicts in Africa?
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back at the Diplomatic Dispatch. Thank you for asking a very difficult question. I think we Africanists love to focus on the positive news from the continent. But I think at the same time, it's very important for us to monitor, understand and analyze these dismal kind of developments as well. Africa today is very much impacted by its history, particularly the colonial history, and therefore it is true to say that in the last 50 years or so, many countries and many regions have gone through various kinds of conflicts. The scholars are agreed that there are three broad categories of conflicts. First, which take place within the borders of a state, which can be called intra-state conflict. Sometimes they are just coups or civil wars or rebellions. But there is another second category, which is intra-state conflict with international engagement, where in a civil conflict or a civil war situation, outside countries come and support one or the other faction. And the third is the inter-state conflicts, where two or more countries of a region get involved in violent clashes. So Africa has seen it all, and I think it can be said that there are many reasons behind this. It is not enough only to say that it is the colonial factor. Indeed, that is significant. I think when the maps were drawn and these states were created, they were created out of the colonial empires, and this cut across the communities and ethnic units which were there together. And so the moment these new national boundaries were drawn, they engendered conflict. But beyond this colonial factor, I think we should recognize that poverty and underdevelopment is a major primary driver for these conflicts. There is not enough resources for people, there is not enough water, food, medical facilities in many parts of Africa, which then leads people and factions and parties to secure them, and therefore the conflict takes place. We can also say that inept leadership in Africa is also responsible.
Ms. Beri, now turning to Sudan, how does this rivalry between the military and the paramilitary group develop?
Yeah, thank you, Vikas, first of all, for inviting me for this very important discussion. Now, it's really strange. We've now seeing, that both these parties, the Sudanese Armed Force and the Rapid Support Group are, involved in hostilities for the last 5 days. But till a few, for a long time since they have been cooperating also. You can see that in 2019 they were together when they ousted the former President Bashir, who had ruled for decades in Sudan and who is currently languishing in the Khartoum jail for war crimes, and has been indicted by the ICC for war crimes. They were also together when the 2021 coup happened. They were part of that coup process, and since then General Burham has been the leader of the governing council which has ruled the country, and General Dagalo has been the deputy. So they have been cooperating. So why did this change happen? So understanding then that we need to understand what this RSF is all about and how did it come about in the recent years. So the genesis of RSF can be traced back to 2003 when President Bashir appointed an organization called the Janjaweed. They were Janjaweed militia, which was led by Dagalo, and they were basically carved out to crush the rebellion in Darfur by President Bashir. Subsequently, in 2013, he made them a formal paramilitary force, and subsequently they have been involved in various security related work in the country. They were also dispatched to Yemen, and they fought along with the Emirati and Saudi armed forces over there. You need to also understand that both the military in Sudan and the RSF have garnered a lot of wealth in the country. They have assets in the economy. Particularly, the RSF has control over the gold mine. I think I can say that the friction between the two emerged after the 2021 coup, when you found that there were conflicting statements issued by the two sides. There were also, you found that military forces were amassed in Khartoum, and there were parallel visits by both sides abroad. That shows that there is something, something wrong in the cooperation between the two sides. And the latest cause of friction between the two is, as you mentioned, the fact that the civil negotiations that were going on, one of the conditions of that was that the RSF should integrate with the Sudanese armed force, and the RSF was not ready to accept the terms which were imposed by the Sudanese military.
Now, Ambassador Bhatia, Sudan has seen repeated pro-democracy protests since the 2021 coup. Will the battle between the army and the RSF make Sudan's transition to democracy more difficult?
I think so. I think the transition would become difficult because now the focus is first of all on cessation of violence, making sure that these two major forces come to some kind of an understanding, and then a kind of a settlement develops among themselves in the first place. The focus will be therefore on the armed forces. The whole idea of bringing democracy in and the entire saga of protests by civilians has obviously been shifted to the back burner. But on the other hand, I would also like to take an optimistic view, and I would argue that whatever legitimacy or credibility the armed forces had, that has now been lost. It has become very clear that it is not just political issues, but at the end of the day, it is the political ambition of the two generals who want to be number one and call the shots completely. The number two trying to be number one and trying to call the shots. This phenomenon will probably in a way help all those people in Sudan who believe that the answer is not army rule, but the rule by the people. So let us be hopeful, even though not in the short term.
Now, Ms. Beri, Sudan is in a volatile region bordering the Red Sea, the Sahel region and the Horn of Africa. Its strategic location and agricultural wealth have attracted regional power plays, with Russia, the United States, Saudi Arabia, the UAE and other powers battling for influence in Sudan. Sudan also shares borders with 7 countries, 5 of those Libya, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, Ethiopia and Chad are already theaters of ongoing conflicts. Egypt and Eritrea are Sudan's other remaining immediate neighbors. So how do you see the broader repercussions of the conflict in Sudan?
Yes, you're right. There are broad implications for the region in terms of the ongoing conflict in Sudan. But as you've pointed out, the Sudan is not the only conflict that is happening in Horn of Africa. We have ongoing conflict in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, in Central African Republic. And over the years, because of this, thousands have been displaced. Millions have been displaced and thousands have lost their lives in the region. Along with this, the region has been also grappling with the non-traditional security issues like the water woes. They've been dealing with scarce rainfall, and that has led to a humanitarian crisis. So obviously this conflict is going to lead to a bigger refugee crisis in the region and add to the water woes in the region. Secondly, I think there's also the threat of rise of extremism and terrorism in the region, because if you see the geographic location of Sudan is wedged between Sahel, which is already undergoing a wave of terrorism and Islamic militancy in the region. And on the east is the Horn of Africa, where Somalia has Al-Shabaab, which has been troubling the region for decades. So, so there is a fear that Sudan may also get embroiled in Islamic militancy in future. The third important impact could be that given the fact that there are a number of external actors involved in the Sudan at the moment. If you look at the peace process that has been going on, there is a Quad which is active with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, US, and other countries which are part of it. And there's also a troika, which is the US, the UN, AU, and the IGAD, which have been involved in this peace process. But these actors, some of these actors have been involved in a greater fashion in Sudan. UAE in particular has been close to the RSF, and UAE has also kept its relationship with the military strong. They have given a lot of money in the recent past to the Sudanese government for economic assistance. They have also invested in the port in the Red Sea. So UAE has a lot of stakes in Sudan. Similarly, Saudi Arabia is also interested in what's happening in Sudan, and you have countries like US which were definitely pro-democracy. The former Prime Minister Hamdok was supported by the Americans. So these countries have shown a lot of interest in what we don't want this rivalry to extend into a conflict zone, that these people intervene. Egypt has supported the military in Sudan in a big way. The current leader of Sudan, Burhan, had trained in Egypt, so therefore he has a close relationship with the Egyptian leadership. So there could be a possibility of the external actors intervening and the situation and flaring further. So we just hope that doesn't happen, and peace prevails. The minds of these external actors do not think on those lines. But if you look at the past history, in the neighborhood Libya, there have been interventions by UAE, by Turkey, and other countries.
Ambassador Bhatia, now the Nile Basin river system flows through 11 countries. The Blue Nile and the White Nile merge in Sudan before flowing into Egypt towards the Mediterranean Sea. Now the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD, which is said to be Africa's largest hydroelectric project when completed, is the source of an almost decade-long diplomatic standoff between Ethiopia and downstream nations Egypt and Sudan, which are completely dependent on the waters of the Nile. Will a full-scale conflict in Sudan derail the already protracted negotiations on the GERD?
This project is a massive project, a very aspirational project, and as you rightly pointed out, it really impacts on a very large chunk of Africa. When we talk about the question of water wars in Africa, many people have projects like this in mind. I think to answer your question directly, whether this would derail the negotiations, perhaps it will not derail the negotiations, but it can certainly delay them, because clearly now Sudan's priority would be to try to set its house in order. Fundamentally, however, on the basis of my limited understanding, I can say that the central issue is really between Egypt and Ethiopia, and it is a typical downstream, upstream story that we are very familiar even in our own part of the world. Sitting here, we normally think that Africans treat each other as truly brothers, and one would therefore think that they would have found by now a solution to this problem rather than leaving to every side to do its own thing. On the basis of the latest research, it becomes very clear that Ethiopia is hell-bent on going ahead with the dam. In fact, it has already started producing electricity for Ethiopia. It's a very expensive, big project, at least $5 billion just for one phase. And because of the resistance and opposition of Egypt, Ethiopia has not been getting enough money internationally, so it is making it with its own money as well. But Egypt's point is also something that has to be taken into consideration. They rather speak openly and bluntly that their intake of water should not be reduced, because this can totally impact on the very existence of agriculture, economy and the nation as such. So, I would say that these developments in Sudan, they certainly are a cause of concern for the larger regional economic purposes, and therefore, I think we in India must fully support the African efforts and international efforts to bring this conflict to an end as soon as possible.
Let's broaden the discussion now to include the larger forces at play in Africa as a whole. Now, Ms. Beri, just when Africa was recovering from COVID-19 pandemic, it has been struck by a range of internal and external shocks, such as you mentioned, adverse weather conditions, a devastating locust invasion, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How has all this impacted the economy of Africa?
Yes, because you are right, COVID as it is had had a deep impact on the African economies, and in the last 2 years there has been recurring activities in terms of weather, climate change, you could say, like cyclones and other issues, which has really left the economy in a very bad state, and also the Ukraine conflict. So first, in terms of the adverse weather conditions, you find that countries like, I can give you some examples, countries like Mozambique and Malawi have faced cyclones in recent years, which have left about 100,000 people have been displaced because of this, and several of them, a lot of infrastructure has faced destruction. Secondly, in Horn of Africa and others, specifically in Horn of Africa, you find that there is a situation of drought because of the scarce rainfall, which has again impacted on the larger economy as such. In fact, there is a report by the UN which says that both the adverse weather conditions and the conflict in Ukraine has led to a decline in the economic growth in Africa from 4% to about 3.5% in 2022. So this shows that these two issues have definitely had an impact. Now, the Ukraine crisis is something which has impacted Africa in a big way. While there has not been much trade between African countries and Russia and Ukraine, but they have been an important partner for food security of the continent, especially in a group of countries in Africa. So you find that, say, in countries like Nigeria, which is a large food importer, 25% of its wheat imports came from Russia and Ukraine. Similarly, countries like Benin, about 100% of their wheat imports used to come from Russia and Ukraine. And there were other countries like Uganda and Tanzania, where 50% of their wheat imports would come from Ukraine and Russia. So these countries had immediate lack of supplies and impacted on their food security. Secondly, the Russian-Ukraine crisis also led to food inflation with the rise in prices of food crops, particularly crops like maize, which saw an increase in prices of about 80%, and flour, which saw a rise in 50%, and oil seeds also the prices increased. So secondly, the energy crisis is also something which has come about because of the crisis in Ukraine, and there has been an escalation in the energy crude oil prices, which has impacted on the African countries like the rest of the world. So the Ukraine crisis and the adverse weather conditions have impacted on the African economies in a big way. The countries have had to spend their, government revenue on a lot of welfare activities. A lot of subsidies have been given for this. So and also the debt to GDP ratio in several countries has increased. So overall, the Africa, you can say, is in a bad shape because of the twin shocks of adverse weather conditions and the Ukraine conflict.
Ambassador Bhatia, now geopolitical competition in Africa has intensified, particularly among great powers such as China, Russia, the US and the EU, but also by middle powers such as Turkey, Japan and the Gulf states. How should India leverage its historically close relationship with Africa for better win-win partnerships?
I think India needs to, first of all, monitor very closely the developments which are taking place in various regions and sub-regions of India. I am not very sure if this is being done very carefully. There is a very small team of people in the government who handle this kind of work. But I think there needs to be a synergy among our officials and among and our Africa experts, so that this task can be sharpened further. The second suggestion basically is that India already has adopted a three-dimensional or three-layered policy in terms of looking at the continental, the regional and the bilateral planes. I think we cannot exclude one over the other. We need to be holistic and cover all the three dimensions, which means that our attempt to talk to the whole continent through the African Union must continue. Therefore, very clearly, India-Africa Forum Summit, which was a very successful and effective institutional mechanism invented by India, should be revived. On the second layer, the regional layer, I think we probably are lagging behind in terms of connecting deeply with some of the successful regions. And finally, bilaterally, we have no choice but to identify 15-20 top countries which are of direct interest to India, and a special effort, not merely political but also financial inputs, will have to be made available for that purpose.
Ms. Beri, can India do anything for Africa as part of its G20 presidency?
Well, I think India is, as you know, as a president of the G20, is striving to, showcase the fact that it is the voice of the Global South. And we also hosted the Global South Summit, a virtual Global South Summit in January, just a month after taking over the presidency, with 120 countries participating. The idea was to invite those countries which are not part of G20, and the message was that it is taking the inputs from the rest of the countries in the Global South as to how the G20 should focus its attention on which are the priority areas of G20. So definitely Global South is important, and since Africa is heart of Global South, Africa would be an important partner for the G20 countries, and India is definitely trying to bring Africa into the G20 gambit. India's relations with Africa have been very close. Its partnership in the last 2 decades has developed in a big way.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Bhatia and Ms. Beri, for taking our viewers through the political, economic, humanitarian and international dimension of the conflict in Sudan. It is clear that unless there is urgent intervention by the African Union and the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, the situation in Sudan will continue to deteriorate, and a full-blown civil war will lead to new crises in a region already battered by conflict and drought, besides becoming a playground for global and regional powers to create more trouble. As the UN Secretary General has said, the only way forward is to return to negotiations that support the Sudanese people's democratic aspirations. That is all I have for you in this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. Thank you for watching. Till we meet again, take care and goodbye.